Hello, you're watching World Talks. My name is Sascha Fahrbach. On April 26, Ukraine marked 40 years since the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. Well, this has led to warnings about nuclear risk as the center of European security and debates more. Furthermore, Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, has accused Russia of nuclear terrorism amid drone activity near sensitive sites, while fresh attacks continue to hit cities, including Odessa. At the same time, NATO readiness is also being discussed following Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk's warning that Russia could pose a direct threat within months. Speak now about all of the latest with Bohdan Nahaylo, editor-in-chief of the Kyiv Post, in the studio. Good to have you with us.
Greetings. Good to be here on my way back from Kyiv, direct.
Let's start with Kyiv. 40 years on Sunday. What kind of, let's say, importance of this nuclear terrorism that Zelensky alluded to, how much does Chernobyl now connect also with the dangers of Zaporizhzhia? Give us your take.
Well, let's step back and just comment on what that international tragedy, global tragedy meant. Not just the physical damage, the medical damage, etc., but essentially the Chernobyl disaster, that explosion blew the lid of the Soviet system. Gorbachev had just come to power. He was acting more or less as his predecessors, and he pretended in his leadership that nothing had happened. You remember there was even a parade in Kyiv on May the 1st. But in Sweden, they were the first to alert the world. So this tradition of secrecy, this tradition of disregard for human life, doing what Moscow feels is right, putting an atomic power station 70 miles from Kyiv on the main source of water for Ukraine and others, that was highly irresponsible, and that triggered a reaction in Ukrainian society. They don't give a damn about us, Ukrainians. Moscow does what it wants. Plus, there were warnings locally from top scientists saying that there are technical problems there. Don't rush things, don't cut corners, and bang, it went. And now today we have Zaporizhzhia, but let's recall that when the Russians launched their full-scale attack in 2022, they came via Chernobyl. They occupied that area for a while. There was a danger that they might, sort of somehow destroy either inadvertently or deliberately the protection there of the sarcophagus, and we would have another disaster. Fortunately, they were kicked out of there. But Zaporizhzhia, at the time, Chernobyl was going to be the world's largest atomic power station. Zaporizhzhia is now the world's largest. It's got 2 more reactors than Chernobyl. And the Russians have captured it, and they are using it both for blackmail and to terrorize the Ukrainian population, to terrorize the West, as it were. But also, at the back of their minds, there's the possibility of making a deal with the Americans. Remember, a few months ago, there was talk about a deal with the Americans to run the Zaporizhzhia power station jointly. Money for Witkoff and Trump and others. But there's the other factor that people often lose sight of, that if the Russians get away with keeping the occupied territories in the east, they want the Zaporizhzhia power station to supply the energy for the occupied areas and beyond. It's also a source of revenue, but also vital energy. So there are many factors here.
Mm-hmm. But also interesting, you said that this disaster blew the lid off the Soviet system. Just curious parallels also. Do you see similar, let's say, patterns of how the Soviets were not accountable to the public, secrecy, with what the Kremlin is doing now?
Absolutely. I mean, the Chernobyl disaster it embarrassed the Soviet leadership, alarmed them, embarrassed them, and it forced Gorbachev to make good on his talk about glasnost, about openness, about restructuring, because he'd driven himself into a corner talking about this while not doing anything in the early months, year of his tenure as party leader. And today also, I think that the fear in the world and within Russia itself, that you're sitting on a time bomb, it's a huge landmine, if you want. And you have kept the specialists away from there. They can't regulate what's going on. The staff are working under immense psychological pressure. And, it's a disaster waiting to happen if things don't change, if the Russians don't pull out or some kind of temporary agreement is used for international oversight and monitoring.
Mm. And also looking at current threats of Russia, if we can just bring it also to our region, to Poland. Recently, the Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, has said, I think this is for the FT just a few days ago, that there is very much a threat that Russia could attack, could be a threat to NATO just in a few months. How do you interpret that? I mean, right now we see so much of resilience in Ukraine, but when we hear words like that, what do you make of that?
Well, they're not just empty words. Not only Poland, but the whole of the NATO system, and including shall we say, the professionals in Washington too, that are not just subservient to Trump. They realize that Moscow is not backing down. That for Putin, this war is, essential to keep him in power. He's gone so far. He's driven himself also into a corner. The losses are immense, the damage to the economy, the damage to the international standing, and only by sort of continuing the war at a higher level, at a higher pace, will he be able to sort of sustain the momentum that keeps him in power. And look at the warning signs. The war economy in Russia is growing despite their losses from sanctions. The emphasis is on going further, not stopping. Grabbing as much as they can, damaging Ukraine both materially but also psychologically as possible, and really, I would say, waving a red flag at the West. How do we interpret Lavrov's statement in the last few days? The West has already declared war on us. Implicitly, he's saying, we are treating you as if we're at war with you, right? And we do see you as a major obstacle to our greatness, to our power structure, to our culture of despotism, etc. So, whether we like it or not, that state of I don't know whether to call it a cold or simmering war or whatever, but it's there. And thank God that in most European countries, the leaderships and the military commands have woken up to this fact and hence are doing a lot more than a year or two ago to consolidate their efforts and to have a more peaceful, purposeful approach. So the difference is that if in the past the response of NATO and European countries and Washington under Biden was reactive, now it's moving towards being proactive, preparing for the future. But that's going to take time, of course.
And also talking about preparing, this is also interesting. I mean, looking at how Ukraine has gone through this war, also developed, this has become a drone war in many ways. We've seen that also with President Zelensky traveling recently in the Middle East, really offering that expertise, armaments, deals, you name it. The Prime Minister also of Poland in Rzeszów today, on Monday, just announcing a drone armada, so a large-scale project with the expertise of Ukraine. Tell us a bit about the significance of that in this whole being prepared against Russia.
Well, it's a very important step also, and it conforms with what Germany, Britain are already doing, to some extent France, getting their act together, but in cooperation with Ukraine, integrating Ukraine into a joint defensive effort, or system, shall we say, where now there's not just having arms ready, but producing them on an industrial basis, revving up the defense sectors in countries like Germany. Who would have imagined 3 or 4 years ago that Germany would be doing this, or that Macron, who was so friendly just 4 or 5 years ago with Putin, would also have taken this stand over the last 2 to 3 years, calling out Trump so publicly for his position, not only vis-a-vis Iran, but Russia and Putin. So we are seeing movement. Ukraine has to hold out for at least another few months, but it is receiving very good positive signals. The financial help, the EU's giant support that went through now that Orban was kicked out. Other signs are there. So Ukraine the mood, I was just at the Kyiv Security Forum on Thursday and Friday in Kyiv. The mood is upbeat in the sense it's tough, but we're in it for the long haul. We hope things will deteriorate in Moscow. That will, undermine Putin's position. But in the meantime, we await for the West to actually consolidate further and for us to be a partner of that. So ultimately, Ukraine would love to be part of NATO, the EU. But for the moment, as an interim solution, integration into almost not an alternative, a parallel structure to NATO, where from which the Americans have de facto withdrawn or are withdrawing, is very good. It's a positive development late in the game.
We're really tight on time. Just one quick one. You said about these integrations, these joint projects, also with different countries, bilaterals. Is that now the new norm? Has NATO sort of not become as that goal for Ukraine as it once was?
Well, look, Ukraine has received clear signals, not just from Washington, but from Germany and from others that no, not yet, not while the war is on. So I think it has to settle for what is doable, what is reachable. And that is not a bad option. It's a lot better than the vacuum that existed and the lack of a light at the end of the tunnel a year ago, 2 years ago. So it's progress, and the Ukrainian leadership also has to be realistic and pragmatic.
All right, so interesting stuff there. Editor-in-Chief of the Kyiv Post, Bohdan Nahaylo, with us. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
And thank you for joining us here on TVP World, but stay right here for more news and commentary. Goodbye.